Hi everyone, and welcome to the Imagining a New We video blog with me, Dr. Samantha Cotrera, a video series designed to help history teachers and other history educators teach history in ways that are more transformative, meaningful, and inclusive for your students. And today we're going to be talking about women, because March 8th is International Women's Day. And while there's a lot of popular and commercial celebrations of women on this day or around this day, what I find really interesting is that when it started in 1909 in the States, it was an initiative of the Socialist Party of America as a way to acknowledge working women. And I really love that kind of connection between labor history and women's history integrated together. And I don't think we necessarily talk about that really explicit integration of working life and labor conditions when we talk about International Women's Day. And so that's a really exciting little piece of history that I think we should talk about more when we're talking about International Women's Day. But aside from that, I know that a lot of you want to bring in more stories of women into your history classrooms, and can struggle sometimes because maybe you don't know who to feature or what to feature or what that would look like. And you know, it's not really an individual problem. Like, you might want to do that and you're an individual, but the problem of integrating women into the curriculum more is not an individual thing. It's not just like you aren't looking hard enough for these stories. I think that it comes down a lot to the curriculum and the way really we think about history. And I say we as like a cultural we, like in a liberal democracy, we as a whole, as a culture, we think about history often as like these great people and these great events. And what constitutes great is often using a standard of like economic, political, military type of criteria that exclude kind of the everyday contributions of women. Now, the historical thinking work that likes to talk about significance as one of their benchmarks can help reframe that, which is really great. But generally, as a whole, because our curriculum and our textbooks and just like our brains are really familiar or like used to this kind of notion of great people and great events as a way to think about the history, like how we think about how we have framed the past, that even when we are trying to identify different types of significant criteria, there's this like lingering effects that something has to be the best. And if you know some of my work, you know that I'm critical of historical thinking, and I think that like the work they do in significance is really cool and important, but then there is still that criteria, right? And as soon as we have that, then we are trying to find the best. And I think that avoiding that provides a lot more space to do some like really cool critical things in history. So one of the things that I do this is going to be a segue to the thing I'm going to be talking about the most today. One of the things that I do is I supervise undergraduate students' proposed undergraduate research at Seneca College. Seneca College has an undergraduate program in a Bachelor of Interdisciplinary Studies, and I supervise students proposing and sometimes collecting the data for their like undergraduate thesis, which has been really cool. And I met a student a couple terms ago who was like, I'm really interested in looking at whether or not women are significant in the history curriculum. And he told me this, and I was like, what now? And so he told me again, and I was like, sorry, are you like tricking me? Like, do you think this is going to be easy because that is my area of study? Sorry, you probably noticed this, but I haven't been looking, that there's a cat that just jumped on top of the bookshelf. So that's cool. Anyway. So I thought he was kidding because I thought he like looked me up as a professor and he's like, that'll be an easy topic. And he didn't. He was like, I don't know what you're talking about. I think this would be a cool topic. And I was like, okay, well, it's going to be difficult because I know all this literature. And he's like, okay. And you know what? It was such a fantastic project. He did such a great job. He did such a great job that I was like, I want this data to be out there. I want this data to be out in the world. And so last year for International Women's Day on March the 8th, I published a blog post on activehistory.ca with his data. His name is Javelin Vijay Kumaran. He is amazing. He gave me full permission to publish his data with his name, because I'm not stealing his work. I want everyone to know that this is his research, but we just didn't have time for him to write the whole thing himself. And what he found when he looked at the Ontario curriculum for grades 7 and 8, he found 5 different things that demonstrated that women aren't really that significant in the curriculum. So what I want to do is I want to go over those 5 different things, because I want to highlight that, like, it's not just you when you're having difficulties bringing in more women to history. And then what I'm going to do is suggest 2 ways, actually 3 ways, that you can integrate the experiences of women into your classroom in more substantial ways, which I hope you'll find useful. So let me go over those 5 different ways. The first way that he found was that he went through all of the examples and sample questions that the Ontario curriculum in grades 7 and 8 identified as, like, here are things that you could talk about related to this particular learning outcome. And he found that men were mentioned at a rate of 4 to 1. Than women. Individual men were mentioned 78 times in these examples and sample questions, and individual women were only mentioned 18 times. That's it. So that was a ratio of 4 to 1. So while these were only examples and samples, you can see that what he found was that when we're thinking of these examples and samples of people and ideas, it is often a privileging of men and men's experiences. So that's the first thing he found. Second thing he found was that when women were introduced, they weren't introduced as just like champions or individuals to celebrate for the sake of celebrating them, but they were always introduced as having a challenge or a struggle they had to overcome. So when women were mentioned, they were brought in as an example of, like, look at this woman overcoming something. It wasn't just a woman and her experiences for the sake of understanding women in Canada and their experiences. The third thing that he found was that feminists, so women and men, but women in particular, women fighting for particular rights of women, were mentioned less often than women who were fighting for general struggles for equity. So women fighting for labor conditions, for example, a general struggle, was featured less than women fighting for particular issues related to women. And this I find really fascinating, because women have always been a part of social movements, of course, but women have also been part of social movements that are specifically women-centric, and these women are not mentioned as much as the women that are part of general struggles. So, you know, what are we missing when we fail to acknowledge the women that have been fighting for particular women-oriented rights? The grade 7 and 8 curriculum in Ontario focuses on, like, pre-1914. So there is a ton of different fights for women's rights that are happening during this period, like that 19th, 20th century, turn of the century, you know, things related to birth control, for example. That isn't in there. So that was really interesting. The fourth thing that he found was that when there were specific events, like the Battle of Plains of Abraham, for example, like these big events, individual women were not named, whereas individual men were. So these big national building events that we like to talk about with our students, for example, women aren't attached to those. Individual men are attached to those, but women are not understood or used as examples of how we can understand this. And again, how interesting is that when we're thinking about these big national moments, women who experienced them and participated in how they developed are not there. So interesting. And the fifth thing was that the Ontario grade 7 and 8 curriculum, like a lot of Ontario's curriculum, was revised in 2018, and it had a revision in 2015. So it wasn't a full revision in 2018. It was just a revision to respond to the TRC's calls to action. So what JaValen immediately saw was that there was a lot of content related to First Nations people, Inuit people, and Métis people in the grade 7 and 8 curriculum. But what he found was that individual indigenous women who were First Nation, Métis, and Inuit were not mentioned in the curriculum. So while there was a lot of content that responded to the TRC's calls to action, women's experiences related to being Indigenous, being Métis, being Inuit, although being kind of redundant now, was not in there. So again, you may say, yeah, I want to bring in more experiences of women into teaching, but the structure of the curriculum, and like I know a lot of the Ontario curriculum writers, they aren't bad and sexist people, but again, it's like this big structure of how we understand history is these big names and big events, and because of the way that history gets written, women are often left out of those big names and big dates. This is the way history is structured. We understand history often as a fantasy echo of the past. And this notion of fantasy echo is from feminist theorist Joan Scott, who said that we will never understand the past. We all know that. We don't need a feminist theorist to tell us that. But that the history we learn is a fantasy of what had happened in the past and an echo. So like the further away we get from the past, the quieter it is, right? So we can never really understand the full past, which we know about, but when we are only looking at history through a particular version of what history could be, we're often, in our liberal democratic society, privileging the experiences of men. So how do we counter this? Well, we can counter this by, one, being aware of the fact that even internally, we can think about teaching history as covering these big people and these big events. If we change our version of understanding the past as like a collection of experiences, we now provide more space to be able to put new experiences in there. So that's the first, to be aware of our own prejudices in teaching history. And I put myself in this category as well, so this is no judgment, but like the work of teaching history is the work of understanding the stories that we have and the stories that we're telling, right? So the first thing is to understand our own prejudices when it comes to how we are thinking about history and whether or not we are privileging big names and big dates because that's what we think history is. So that's number one. The second thing is to acknowledge women's work. And this comes down to that 1909 call for celebrating working women by the Socialist Party of America in creating International Women's Day. Acknowledge women's work. And by that I mean acknowledge that women have always worked outside the home, sometimes with pay, sometimes not for pay, for as long as there was work outside the home. And the more we split this notion of like the men went out and did all the business, the women stayed home and took care of the kids, the more we disvalue the fact that women have always worked outside the home. And like that is a key element of how the world has functioned. Sometimes they worked in factories, sometimes they worked in family businesses, sometimes they brought in piecework. Like, you know about a lot of the different labor practices. Don't ignore that, and don't just like assume that like that is rare. It's not rare. It's there. And I get so excited about this because when I worked at Black Creek Pioneer Village, which is a living history museum, and people would go into trades buildings and say to a woman who was an interpreter, like, wow, you weren't supposed to be here, huh? Well, no, there was no not supposed to be here. We create these kind of gender binaries, but they weren't as like clear cut as we're thinking, because just like of the nature of how life works. So don't ignore women's work, but also that women's work in the home, we need to acknowledge is like central to how a society functions. Taking care of children, cooking food, doing laundry, keeping a house clean, these are essential attributes to how societies and cultures function. And it's really easy to be like, mom just stayed home and took care of the kids. That sense of care work and that sense of managing a home is essential to how we are able to live our lives. An example that I've used quite a few times is like, we'll talk about John A. Macdonald, but we never think the woman that cleaned his house, the women that cleaned his house, and the women that cooked his food as equally significant. So let's just not, different cat, see, one cat, two cats. Let's not ignore that work. Let's not ignore the work, that care work at home as essential to keeping a society functions. Because any of you that work full-time and manage a home know that managing a home is a full-time job, and that it keeps everyone functioning. It keeps all the people in your household functioning. The third thing I'm going to recommend to do to help bring in more women into history is to just kind of like explore archives. Not like going into archives necessarily, but the other day I was looking for a book that I saw, that A Mighty Girl is a website that has all these really cool resources for children, primarily girls, books, toys, clothes sometimes, that help support like positive self-image. And I saw this really cool history book that they promoted on Facebook, and I went to my public library and I typed in the name of the book, and it was something like An Outstanding Woman, something like that. And they didn't have that book, but what it did was pulled up all of the Toronto Star stories that featured the phrase outstanding woman throughout the Toronto Star history, because the Toronto Public Library has the Toronto Star archives. So I saw all of these really cool photographs that I never would have imagined looking for, knowing where to start, like none of that. So go on Flickr, and the link below will take you to a Flickr, like that's a photo sharing site, if that's not too out of date right now. Take you to a Flickr album or a search function that I created for you. Go to Flickr and just like type in some random words and see how and where women show up, because you'll find them everywhere. You'll find us everywhere. And I did a webinar for Canada's history a few years ago. You'll also see the link on that page if you click the link below. And I said that using archival photos to just show that like we were there, they were there in the past, helps broaden our perspective of what history can do. So just like, on your phone, just type in some random words and see how and where women pop up, and just bring that into your classroom, not as like these special things, but as a key element of culture and society, because that's what women are, right? We hold up half the sky. So in honor of International Women's Day, I want to leave you with this. One, it is not your fault that it's difficult to bring in women. It is a part of the structure of both the curriculum, but also like how we understand the past. So the second thing is, if you are interested in bringing more women in, the ways that you have to do it is to like challenge that structure, to think about experiences in history, to think about new words and ideas to search for or to bring in ideas, and to acknowledge the scope of work that women do in society as a central part of understanding the past. That's a lot of ideas, but I hope it gives you some things to think about. If you click the link below, like I said, you'll see the blog post with Javelyn's excellent work, some other links and resources that can help you with this topic. Rose Feinmeier, a former Governor General, Canadian History Teacher Award winner, as well as a scholar in this area and a friend of mine, wrote a companion piece to Javelyn's research. So I'll put a link there. And let me know if you have any tips and tricks for really normalizing the experiences of women in the curriculum as a key element of your teaching practice. So in this short video, although it seems like it's longer than I initially intended it to be, which seems to happen a lot, I hope it gives you some food for thought. Spring is coming, March break is coming, and maybe if you have some mental space, you can think a little bit more about what this looks like. Let me know if you do, and if you need more resources, check out my new book. It's coming out in August 2020, Transforming the Canadian History Classroom, Imagining a New We. I'd love to connect with you more about how we can do this in your classroom even more. So have a great day, everyone. Enjoy the sunshine as we are coming into spring, and happy International Women's Day.